It's going to be a busy 30-minute conversation, a lot to get through, and we're going to try as best we can to get to some of your questions really quickly. So let's just quickly introduce the expert panel. You can see a full list of the bios on the event website, but starting with Irene Andriopoulou, who's Head of Research, Studies and Educational Programs at EKOME. Irene is a media literacy researcher, policy analyst, practitioner, and advocate for nearly 20 years. Paolo Cesarini is member of the Management Committee of the European Media and Information Fund. He's a former senior European Commission official with extensive expertise in competition and digital single market policy. He's also a senior advisor at TENEO. And finally, Emily Evans, who you saw earlier, is Chief Executive of the Economist Educational Foundation. That's a charity that she founded from within the Economist newspaper. They work to empower disadvantaged young people with critical thinking and communication skills. So thank you all three for joining us, and thank you for all of those who've chosen this breakout session today. Let's get to a question just to run from the earlier discussion, Emily. When you've been looking at the different kind of work that the Economist Foundation has done, what is working and where are the gaps when we look at media literacy?
So to reiterate some of the things that I said earlier, I guess, I think the thing that I want to emphasize definitely does work is having really high quality discussions about the news in schools, in our classrooms. And we're quite clear about what a high quality discussion means. So as I said before, make sure that you're bringing in the facts to these conversations. Make sure that you're exposing young people to different perspectives, that you're teaching them not only to question information, but also to listen. I'm so passionate about that. We have to teach young people to listen and be open to receiving the facts, or everything else is worthless. And also we have to be explicit about the importance of these skills. So we also talk to young people about why it matters for them to learn to be critical thinkers and people who can communicate and create a sense of identity as somebody who wants to be able to have a civil conversation with people who might see things differently to them. So great conversations about the news that are expert informed, expose the different perspectives, and get kids talking and expressing their ideas.
Thank you. And Paolo, let's turn to you. I mean, the fact that we have today over 300 people watching live this event shows there is an interest. There's also an interest in publishers, in journalists, but also in policymakers too.
Yes, indeed. I mean, let me start with an initial remark. That media literacy has become an important topic for policymakers during the last decade, and still is. I was reading again recently a report from the Council of Europe from 2017, which shows how media literacy has become a critical element for our societies, and it has been for the first time an opportunity this report to map out the projects in the media literacy field. More than 400 projects have been studied and examined, and this report shows how during the last decade there have been important improvements in this field. The first, it is that raising awareness in the regulators, across regulators, I would say, about the need to adapt, adjust, develop new methodologies in educational programs in school. The second important element is that it has become clear for all relevant stakeholders that the new digital environment raises challenges that can be addressed only through a multi-stakeholder approach, as has been said before, and that requires also targeted approaches addressing citizens of all ages, so also in out-of-school contexts. And thirdly, there I think higher awareness about the need to work together more in the future and to exchange best practices as they are developed through concrete projects. Of course, there are also a lot of shortcomings in this field. The approaches remains very fragmented. Well, there is the need to have projects that have an impact, so to scale up projects in this area, and to remedy to existing imbalances, geographically speaking, if you look at Europe. More has been done since 2017, since the date of publication of this report. I think the Commission has been in particular very much involved in this area, from the high-level group on disinformation to the most recent action plans for European democracy and for media of last December 2020. There is also an ongoing work done by a new expert group just constituted in the area of digital education, and their task is to develop exactly guidelines for best practices in the media literacy field that are specifically tailored for educators and trainers. That is very important, I think. Indeed, there is also important initiative. The European Digital Media Observatories, it is one of them, and I think it is something we should all be proud of, because that is really a hub that coagulates efforts from different perspectives, private sector, public sector as well. And last but not least, I would mention the European Media and Information Funds that has been launched today, actually, and that exists thanks to the inaugural contribution, generous contribution by Google, in which hopefully will address issues of impact in projects, including the media literacy field, in the near future.
Thank you, Paolo, and definitely keen to talk more about fund and how people can apply and learn more about that in a moment as well. But you mentioned there about geographical imbalance. I guess with that also comes language, so that'd be interesting to dig into that a bit more as well. And finally, let's hand to Irene. You've been thinking about media literacy for many years and researching. Where do you think there are some gaps, or where do you think there could be more discussion, research, or work across Europe?
Yeah, well, I actually agree with all the participants taking into an interdisciplinary and a multi-stakeholder approach, of course, because even though we're at a stage where that could be described as the end of digital beginning, following a 20 years period of optimism and somewhat euphoria, about the digital onset, there are still many challenges ahead, and so we have always to be on alert. So we have to think proactively and approach this new digital hybrid economy knowledge model that is mainly posed also by the pandemic. And as UNESCO Media and Information Literacy Alliance stipulates, media and information literacy that engulfs media education and digital literacy should be for all and by all. So we need an overarching policy on media literacy within a multi-stakeholder governmental model. So having said that, I have used the 5 Ws of the journalistic research in an interrogative approach. So the 5 Ws is who are the main players? We need to define the main players, and also we need to define the target group. As Paolo said, it's about, of course, children and youth. It's also about senior citizens. It's about the social minorities. Media literacy should address social minorities, the so-called digital deprived communities, and also special target group that has to do with the journalists. To acquire the new media literacy skills that are necessary to approach the new media intelligence. Then what is at stake? We need to be careful and to be very specific on what we're trying to deal with, what we're talking about. What is misinformation? What is disinformation? And why it was such a vivid phenomenon during the pandemic that the World Health Organization talked about the infodemic phenomenon, with fatal effects many times for the citizens. So we need to define that. Where? Are we talking about the online environment? I would say we're talking about the online environment, but the physical environment at the same time, because it's a holistic approach on critical media literacy skills. When? Yesterday, today, tomorrow. I would say yesterday. There are many steps being taken from regulators, from policymakers, from NGOs, private, public initiatives, and we need to all put them into a joint umbrella, synergies, a joint infrastructure. And which has to do with the medium. It's a medium related point, a platform related, content related, alongside the audience related issues. Following the McLuhan theory about the medium is the message. And I would also ask the how. It is how to achieve that media literacy for all is through meaningful, as someone said earlier, meaningful, large-scale, multi-stakeholder collaboration, to also adapt a global approach to embrace the global initiatives, but also approach the grassroots, the bottom-to-top actions on a local level that are very useful. They have cultural particularities, but they're very useful for international dialogue and intercultural dialogue. So all in all, there are also steps that need to be taken on the media literacy policy infrastructure in accordance with the EU regulation, more self-regulatory and co-regulatory actions of the media industry and the internet service providers. And this is where also the AVMSD 2018 has defined media literacy not only as an individual skill, but as a social corporate responsibility, as a responsibility that the media industry should take into account. And then followed and coupled with constant research by the academia, evidence-based research to listen and evaluate emerging trends and problematics.
Thank you for that. Let me just take some of the questions on the Q&A app. And Rizwana, happy to read that question out, or you can unmute and read it yourself.
Yeah, hi. I'm listed there as you. My name is Rizwana Hamid. I'm the director of the Centre for Media Monitoring, and a lot of the discussion has focused on media literacy as far as the viewer, reader, or user is concerned. And I think what we're missing here is a lack of literacy amongst journalists themselves when it comes to certain information, communities, etc. And we specifically monitor the media in how they report on Muslims and Islam, and have found huge amounts of illiteracy. And I think that needs to be brought into the conversation, because often what's happening now is what appears in mainstream media is then picked up on social media, and that disinformation is kind of, magnified a million times over. And so I think it's really important to kind of look at ourselves as well. My background is in journalism, but I think it's important to also kind of include that as a factor in media literacy as well.
Thank you for that. And let me hand that to Emily. What do you have a perspective on that? And there's also a question from Irene, which is, around the teaching students how to do journalism well. So maybe there's sort of two tracks there, but how do you respond to Rizwana's comments?
So I think, that's not going to be my area of expertise, but I have a view on it, which is that I massively agree. It's very difficult to disagree with that it's important not to assume that journalists are perfect at this. So yeah, I really agree, and some of the other panelists might have sort of more expert things to say. I work with a lot of journalists, and I work with a lot of amazing journalists, but I still see some of that. So yeah, and I had a few points. It's really interesting listening to the other speakers, and I wanted to pick up on some of those if I can really quickly do that. That I think the Paolo's point about the importance of raising more awareness of media literacy, and sort of making more policy. Yes, but one thing that frustrates me sometimes is that often when you're in the room with policymakers, there's so much consensus. Everybody in the room agrees what we need to do. We actually already know what we need to do. And if we're talking about young people, then this has to happen in education. It has to happen in education systems. And so we know what we need to do. We need to carve out the time in schools to be focusing on media literacy. And one of the things that I see in the UK education system, and I know happens in other education systems, is you kind of tinker at the edges. And people like us get together and we're so passionate about it and we care about it, but we all agree. And I think what we have to push for is for us to actually be ambitious about making the space for this in our schools. And what's really exciting at the moment is that after a year of disruption in education, we have this once in a lifetime window to genuinely rethink education. So that's the thing that I would say. Yes, we need to continue raising awareness and we need to look at policy, but we're already quite aware. So we also have to just do it. And that kind of goes to Irene's point as well, that it's about giving young people the skills really broadly. On that where point, is it online or is it physical? I think we have to be really careful about not separating those out too much, because in a digital age, our information still comes to us in lots of different ways, through the conversations we have by people who've been influenced by online misinformation.
Thank you. Paolo?
Yes, I would like to best reply to the question by Rizwana. I agree with your analysis concerning the need to enhance the journalistic skills across the board. I don't know whether that it is an issue for media literacy programs or more broadly for programs that support media as such. So we know that it's become a very vulnerable sector due to the declining resources in advertising, due to the fact that new business models struggle to reach and convince new audiences. There is the issue of also access to data, how to tailor content that really appeals to people's interest, and that it is something that, in my view, needs to have a specific line of actions that are designed to support the media sector more broadly. Coming to what Emily was saying, yes, indeed, I fully agree with you. I mean, in schools, we all, teaching in school, everybody agrees, but not enough has been made in order to identify what it is really needed for that to, break through. I think there are four main issues that here we need to think about it. One, it is the evolution of the educational approaches and methodologies. We need approaches that combine really in an effective way all the technical, digital, technical, cognitive, social, civic, but also creative capacity of people. And by doing that, I think there would be more room also for rethinking educational programs in schools. But we also need to think about how people can cope with a very real problem, information overload or cognitive overloads that are created by the proliferation of new media, and which have put people in a situation where they're not able to select the information they really want to access. And the third issue is about how to bring awareness that empower citizens to cope with the unconscious cognitive basis that increasing level of exposures to digital media and screens has generated. So that is an issue about to learn how to critically assess the content as such, not the media, but the content as such. And finally, I would say that there is also an important role for platforms, and Google is at the forefront of these efforts in order to imagine how to tackle the question that has been evoked before. So the speed of creation and the speed of dissemination or propagation of information and disinformation online. So how to enable to services, new features that raise the level of attention, capture attention of people on information that is of quality, which has quality standards, which is trustworthy.
Thank you. Very quick response from Irene, then we'll get to the last two questions. We'll try and squeeze them in.
Yep, I would just like to add to what Paolo said, that in terms of media literacy skills for journalists, there is also the EU funding, the new EU funding of 3.9 million for actions to support media freedom and investigative journalism. So it calls for projects that have to do with acquiring new media literacy skills for journalists, like investigative data journalism, big data, education and social rights journalism, the whole new media intelligence that has to do with the echo chambers, the bots, etc. And the second point about the education in school, okay, it is common knowledge. We have been discussing this over 20 years about integrating media literacy in schools. Now it's about new media literacy. it is a necessity. It has to happen today because children are the digital natives. They are in front of a screen from the moment they are born. Taking pictures from the hospital. So they are very very enthusiastic about using the new media. So we have their attention. What we have to do is to make good use of their attention and exploit all the creative abundant resources that are out there, and there are quite a lot.
Thank you. Christian Tarchi has posted a question. Most of the focus is put on skills, but in some cases, users may have at least some critical thinking skills, but not the motivation to use them. Thinking is time and resource consuming, and people need to be disposed to do such efforts. Is there any action that targets motivation disposition? So how can we encourage people to use the media literacy skills that they are going to acquire? Irene, any thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting question. Motivation can either be coming from an inside interest from yourself. I mean, you want to be informed, you want to be an informed citizen, so you want to look into the news and find out what's there every day. But I think that the most important motivation has to come from early childhood, from cultivating media literacy skill as life skills. So you want, as a child, as a curious child, you want to not to be left behind. And there is also this form of the fear of being left behind. So children want to be connected all the time. So the motivation should be the creative aspect, not the protectionist aspect from the media, but the creative, all the things you can do through games-based learning, social media, fact-checking games, all the things that children can be enthusiastic about. And then once they are familiarized with them in the typical education, they can acquire them as life skills.
Thank you. We're going into quick fire round now to get through some of these questions. So let's go to Irene again. Emily, can you give us a bit more detail about how you're thinking about teaching children the journalistic behaviours?
Yeah, so actually, we don't focus really on teaching kids to be journalists. We focus on teaching kids to be able to think well and speak well about current affairs. So some of them do get really passionate about journalism, and that's great, but we really want them to be great consumers of information more than anything. And I agree with Irene's point. I think partly that's about gamification, and our program does some gamification, but it's also, I think, about identity. So we want these kids to identify as people who are proud that they think critically and can have great conversations about the important issues that are shaping their lives and shaping the world. And I think that's part of the motivation for wanting people to put in the cognitive effort when they're engaging with the world around them. So it's not just about wanting them to aspire to be journalists, it's about wanting them to aspire to be people who can think and speak well about what's going on in the world in a digital age where they're presented with overwhelming information, to Paolo's point, as well as a lot of misinformation.
Thank you. And Paolo, let me hand you Henk's question, which talks about this kind of global effort, I suppose, and the localization. Earlier speakers spoke about a global effort to fight misinformation. Doesn't media literacy mean by default that we have to localize our efforts? My students in Myanmar gave themselves a 10 in media literacy because they all knew Facebook. When working in New York, people gave themselves a 5. So what do you think about this sort of localization piece and the fact that media literacy needs to show up in a local way?
Yeah, tempted to reply to your question by saying that disinformation is a global challenge. It is global because of the nature of the enablers that have made this phenomenon so widespread and impactful. So we are talking about platforms, a new system of communication that have a global reach. But at the same time, we are talking about audiences which are very much influenced by narratives and also by cultural reflex that are national in nature. So you really need to have a system whereby you identify the common challenges, you identify what works, so what are the methodologies that really works, I mean, this idea of gamification, for instance, this problem of raising motivation, using identity as an empowerment tool rather than a polarization item, right? These type of things are apply across the board, I think, independently from the geography. But then when it comes to the implementation, when it comes to identify the projects that work on the ground, I think you need to also to inject some ingredients that are really telling and reflect the mentality at the local level. So there is a real work to be done in terms of designing projects that have a real multiplier effect, because they draw out from the best practices new methodologies that are adapted to this ever-changing information environment. And this should require more training for trainers, so the actual multipliers. Then probably you need more tailored made materials, multilingual materials, tailor-made by identified the most vulnerable groups. And the vulnerable groups are certainly the kids, but don't forget that disinformation, according to certain studies, hits especially the coronavirus. Disinformation has eaten ranges of population where the second most vulnerable range, it is above 55. So how to reach these people, and that requires materials that can be readily used in different contexts, and also a strategy. And for that, it is important that the cooperation with platforms becomes really effective, because strategy means that for these groups of people that cannot be reached in school, and where do you reach them? Well, you reach them on the medium where they get the information in the first place. And that it is something that I would leave open for next developments. And there is a lot of work to be done in the context of a code of practice, but also in other contexts, more practical, more project-driven.
And building on that, maybe Pedro Almeida's question, maybe one for you, Irene. In my view, it is clear that we need to join efforts and collaborate to influence policymakers to create formal human and infrastructures in the EU that are formally assigned to work on media literacy and disinformation standards. We should first agree, though, on the definitions and afterwards on the methodologies. Do you think that there is a common understanding of what media literacy means? You're on mute, Irene.
I would suggest to not focus so much on the definition. It's a long due issue, and the main issue that we understand what it is about, and not so much about the definition. There is also the challenge that if we all join forces together, either on a European level or on a global level, and here I have to mention also UNESCO that is pursuing a global policy on media literacy, media and information literacy. If we all join forces, then it will be a chain gang effect, as I call it, for the national public policies. If it's there, they have to deal with it. They have to do something about it in terms of legislation and regulation, because the ultimate challenge is how to create overall, I would say, digital, emotional, intelligent people, user. We know that they know how to use digital media, but they need to have this emotional intelligence in the digital environment. That would be my point of view on that.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you, Luis Iglica, and to Mark for your comments and questions. As you can maybe see, time is against us. We have about 1 minute 30, so I'm going to ask Paolo to finish us up with a very quick 1 minute. What should people do if they're interested to learn more about the European Media and Information Fund?
What people should do more to know about it? Or,
yeah.
Well, go to the website, I would say. I mean, it has been launched today. See how it will operate, and the operation will start soon. I mean, the ambition is to start to launch the first call for projects in the area of fact-checking in the next November. And then our ambition is to follow suit at the beginning of the next year to finance a range of new projects, which include media literacy and research. So what I can say, I'm conscious of the time. I could say many things about it. But honestly, the best thing is to say to those who follow us is to stay tuned and follow the development on the EMIF website.
Perfect. That was perfect to time as well. We have 10 seconds. So I'll say a big thank you to Paolo, Irene, and Emily for your talks and your participation today. Thank you for all your questions and for joining. The website is, thank you, is the website for the fund is emifund.eu. Bye for now.